Welcome to the finishing the liner video. First thing that we're going to do is separate our zipper plackets from each other, just like that. And I am going to now fold this placket in half and line up the placket edges and then clip the center mark into the raw edge of the placket. Just like that. So now I have a little center mark right in the center of my placket, and I'm going to do the same thing to the other side. And next I am going to grab one of my upper contrast pieces, and I am going to match up the center mark on the bottom of the upper contrast piece with the center mark I just clipped into the zipper placket. But it's very important to make sure that the right side of your zipper is against the right side of your upper contrast. So lay that right sides together, align the center mark, and clip that edge together. Okay, so our zipper placket is now clipped to the bottom edge of our upper contrast piece. And again, make sure that the right side of your zipper is against the right side of your upper contrast piece. And we're going to baste that edge to connect these. I have gone ahead and basted my second zipper placket to my second upper contrast piece. And a good rule of thumb to make sure that your zipper is facing right sides together with your upper contrast piece is that the tail of the zipper should be facing in opposite directions on each of your upper contrasts. Next, what I like to do is decide which side of my liner panel I'd like on the back of my bag. And what I generally like to do is have my slip pocket be on the back side of my bag, so basically against my body when I'm carrying my bag. So I'm going to connect it with the upper contrast piece that has the zipper tail facing this direction. And that way the end of my zipper can be pointing towards my back when I'm carrying my bag. And that's purely preference, so you can do whichever side you'd like. And I'm going to put my upper contrast piece right sides together with my liner panel. And I'm going to align the bottom edge of the upper contrast with the top edge of my liner panel. And I like to align the center marks first, and then the edges should also line up. And clip this in place. Okay, and we're about to sew this edge at our normal seam allowance, but what I want to make sure that I'm doing is keeping the zipper tail out of this seam. So I'm actually going to clip the zipper tail to the top of my upper contrast piece so it doesn't get caught in this seam. Okay, my upper contrast piece has now been stitched to my liner panel, and when I flip that up, I should be seeing the wrong side of the zipper, and I'm going to fold that upper contrast piece up and open up this seam. And on the back side, the seam allowance of the upper contrast and the liner panel are both going to be pointing towards the bottom, and we're going to top stitch this seam through the liner panel and the seam allowance. Okay, our liner panel and our upper contrast piece are now top stitched along this seam, and I went ahead and attached the second upper contrast piece to the second liner and top stitched that as well. So next what we're going to do is put these two pieces right sides together. And I like to, before I do anything, line up this seam here, the one that connects the upper contrast to the liner piece. And I like to peel this back a little bit and line it up even towards the center, because what we're going to be doing is stitching down the sides here at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And so you want to make sure that they're aligned not just at the edge of the two panels, but further in as well. And that way, when we sew at our 1/2 inch seam allowance, these two seams will still line up. So I'm going to clip those together, and then I'm going to clip down the side edge, lining up the sides. And I'm going to flip this around and do the same thing to the other side, but also you want to make sure that your zipper tails stay out of this seam. So I'm going to actually pull them up a little bit and clip them to the top of my upper contrast piece. So again, I'm going to line up these seams further in than just the edge of the bag and clip those in place like that. And then I'm going to continue to clip all the way down the side of the bag. Now I am not clipping the bottom of my bag yet, but I do want to make sure that it's aligned as well. And then I'm going to sew only the clipped edges, so only down the side and this side as well. And I'm going to leave the bottom open for now and sew at our regular seam allowance. Okay, so both sides of our liner panels have been stitched together and the bottom is still open, as you can see here. And I also made sure that my zipper tails did not get caught in that side seam. So this next part is a little bit tricky, but I'm going to open up the side seam allowance, and from the inside, I'm going to top stitch that seam open all the way down to the bottom. And this side of the bag is going to want to get in your way while you're doing this, but you should be able to get all the way down to the bottom of the bag and then turn and come back up the other side so that both of these sides of the seam allowance are top stitched flat. And that is going to help your liner sit really nicely inside the bag once it's constructed. You can also use double-sided tape to stick the seam allowance down if you want to, so that you don't have to keep it open with your fingers while you're sewing. So I'll show you what I do. Okay, so I'm going to put this underneath my needle with the seam allowance open, and I'm going to stitch just to the side of this seam. And this side of the bag, the other side of the bag, is going to want to get in your way, but you can just keep pulling it back as you push the material through the needle. And I'll show you how I do that here. Back stitch at the start and then stitch down, making sure that the seam allowance stays open. I'm going to put my hand underneath here so that I know that the seam allowance is staying open. And then I am going to keep stitching all the way down. And once I get to a point where this side of the bag is in my way, I'm going to just pull it out of my way and then keep going. Okay, I'm about to approach the bottom. So once I hit the bottom, I'm actually going to lift my foot, stitch across the seam, making sure that the seam allowance stays open. And then I'm going to go and pivot so that I'm sewing back up the seam towards the top of the bag. And this side is going to be easier because the farther that you go back towards the top of the bag, the less this side of the bag is going to want to be in your way. So just go slow and make sure you know where all your fabric is. My seam allowance, I can feel that it's still open. I'm about to start stitching on the upper contrast again. And I can back stitch at the top. Okay, you can see here that I have stitched on both sides of this seam, and then from the outside of the bag, you can see that my seam is all the way open, all the way down. And I'm going to repeat that on the other side. Okay, I have now top stitched down both sides of the side seams, and those will now sit very nicely inside the bag at the end. We are now going to move on to the final construction of our bag.